Good morning, everyone. My name is Herman Pretorius, and I am the IRR's head of strategic initiatives. And people have asked me what that job entails, and the best I can say is it is to take the brilliant ideas of my colleagues, one of them the most brilliant joining us this morning, and to try and popularize them and to make sure that we get the message out about what has gone wrong, what South Africans should say no to, what South Africans should say yes to. In short, it's a bit conversation starter type work that I tried to do. So this morning, the conversation really, we tried to set it on another front. We have, over the last few months, been very active as the Institute of Race Relations in news media, on social media, but we thought it would be a very good opportunity to engage directly with our friends, our followers, our supporters, and of course those people who disagree with us, who do not think that this bill, or perhaps expropriation without compensation more broadly, is something that South Africans should be concerned about. Now, that said, we think it is, and in fact we are pretty sure it is. And part of why we can be sure is we have the brilliant work of Dr. Anthea Jeffery, who joins us this morning. Anthea is the head of policy research at the Institute of Race Relations, and she is, I think, the expert on the National Democratic Revolution, the ideology and policy surrounding that, the manifestation of it in terms of the People's War during the last days and decades of apartheid, and of course its continuation as a political framework strategy today. Anthea is also the author of the IRR's submission opposing the Expropriation Bill that was submitted to Parliament, and that almost 20,000 people have now endorsed and sent to Parliament in their own name, saying that they stand with the IRR to protect the right of South Africans to own securely what they have worked hard to earn. So that brings the total number of South Africans who've taken a stand with the IRR to around 300,000, because as we know, there are two parallel processes around property rights currently going. There's the amendment of Section 25 of the Constitution, but then there is this parliamentary legislative process, and not necessarily a constitutional process per se, but we will get into that later, that deals with the Expropriation Bill as a successor to the 1970s, I think 1975, Expropriation Act. So that being said, we are glad that almost, essentially 300,000 people have joined us in this fight, and it has really made an impact. Anthea has played an immense role in making sure that we can build this climate of opinion to say it is not right for the state to destroy property rights. And to explore that further, enough from me. Let's get over to why people are here, and it's over to you. And thank you so much for joining us. Perhaps I can throw you a simple question that I actually did not include in the list of questions as I was setting them up, but it is perhaps something that we should clear out, is why does this expropriation bill matter so much?
It matters so much for the reasons you've really been hinting at. Property rights are crucial to prosperity. This is evident from countries right around the world. And the countries which have destroyed property rights, often in the pursuit of similar goals to our governments, most recently in Zimbabwe and Venezuela, have paid an enormously heavy economic price for it. Economies which were quite successful have tanked. Unemployment has soared, inflation has soared, people's savings have been decimated, hunger has grown, people have had to flee from their homes and try and find refuge in other countries. And it's just a further pointer to the importance of property rights. Once you have property rights, you have a degree of security against a government, which cannot then turn land and other property into a patronage tool to be used to buttress its own power and undermine your possibility of building up assets into something that you can transfer to your children and see your own standard of living rise over time through the way in which you're able to build up the value of a home, a farm, a business, and so on.
So those properties that you just mentioned, we've been hearing a lot from the government, specifically last year from Minister De Lille, about this the scope of property affected by this bill. Now we know that the land issue has been really, in a way, disproportionately blown up and weaponized by political actors. I mean, our most recent polling, again, shows that land isn't this pressing concern, this pressing need. It's not the great unaddressed demand and priority of citizens. But that has been the angle of sale, as it were, on EWC broadly, but on this expropriation bill specifically. Now, to hone in on that, which types of property are affected or placed at risk by this expropriation bill?
To understand that, you need to look at the definition of property in the bill, which echoes the definition in the Constitution. And it says very clearly, property is not limited to land. So you already have, for example, a Constitutional Court judgment saying that property extends to a license to sell liquor. So it could certainly extend to a mining right, for example. And if we look at the whole panoply of assets that are important to people, this bill can affect not only farms and homes, but also shopping centers, factories, business premises, mines, and also shares in companies. We know that the EFF is very keen for the government to nationalize the shares in the South African Reserve Bank. Well, that's the kind of property that could be affected by the bill, and equities in other companies too. So it's extraordinarily wide-ranging, and to pretend that it's limited to land is really pulling the wool over people's eyes.
Before today's conversation, we asked on social media, on Facebook and Twitter, which questions would people want answered, and that question, this specific one of the property affected by this bill, was really popular in both our Facebook audience and our Twitter audience. And to perhaps delve just a level deeper on that property question. So the first lie perhaps that one can label is that they've said it's just about land, with a very strong insinuation that it's about a specific, ownership, white ownership, essentially, of land. And you say that's blatantly not the case. So then we must look at the second argument. Does this, as the government says, empower South Africans to, become property owners, or to own property, to go from being disadvantaged under the apartheid dispossession to now being empowered and be full participatory owners in a property rights based model?
Unfortunately not. What the expropriation bill does, of course, is to empower the government to acquire land, to take either the ownership of it or perhaps the custodianship of it. And then the expropriation bill itself, of course, is silent on what happens thereafter. But we know that it is government's policy not to transfer ownership of land, even to Black South Africans who've been disadvantaged in the past. It's willing to provide people with access in the form of, say, leases or land use rights. But that kind of agreement is always a tenuous one. We know that a lease of that kind can easily be terminated by the government. We also know that in the case of the land reform program to date, many of the farmers who would have hoped to get at least a 30-year lease from the government have instead been given just, as it were, occupation rights that continue from month to month and can be terminated at any time. They're mere caretaker agreements. But the government would say it has provided access to land. What it certainly has not provided is the possibility of that land becoming an asset in the ownership of a particular individual. And the further tragedy of it really is that we have gone far down the path of extending ownership to Black South Africans. From the apartheid days, when the ownership of both houses in the urban areas and land in the rural areas was barred to Black South Africans. They weren't allowed to purchase. That changed beginning really in the 1970s and culminating in 1991 when the Land Acts were repealed. And as a result, we now have something like 9.7 million South Africans who do, Black, coloured and Indian South Africans who own homes. Often they don't have the full title deeds that they should be granted, but they do have ownership in the sense of an informal kind. That simply needs to be formalized, not taken away from them. And the same with the 17, 18 million people who live in the former homeland areas. They have informal rights to customary plots, which need to be formalized rather than potentially taken away from them. And all the people who have bought land since the Land Acts were repealed also need protection for their property rights, not the possibility that they may lose their property to the government.
And I think it's very
Sorry, Herman, you're breaking up.
To note that this isn't oppositional scaremongering for the sake of oppositional scaremongering. We have at least two very concrete instances. Hi, Anthea. I'm so sorry. Apparently one really shouldn't ask the tough questions about expropriation without compensation. I do apologize for that technical interruption. Let me take off where I left off. We have to be clear that this isn't oppositional scaremongering. We have at least two very concrete examples of where the government has made its intention, specifically on Black property ownership, quite clear. And that is the official policy document of the government from 2013, and of course, the court case of David Rakase. Anthea, there we go. Sorry, we just muted for a second.
Oh, sorry. Yes, to start with the policy, it has a long name, the State Land Lease and Disposal Policy, and it makes it very clear that if you're a very small-scale Black farmer, if you're simply producing on a subsistence basis, you must be a perpetual tenant of the state. If you're producing in part for the market, then you must take an initial lease of 30 years, and then probably another one of 20 years, and then after 50 years, you might have an option to buy the land. And in those 30 to 50-year period, your lease can be terminated at any time for what the document calls a lack of production discipline. And if that happens, then any fixed improvements that the farmer has made to the land will pass to the state, generally for compensation. So it makes people extremely vulnerable. And as I said earlier, very often, even the 30-year leases, which might provide some sort of security, though only a limited security, are not granted, and people end up with these caretaker agreements running from month to month and with an acute degree of insecurity. And then we also have the case of David Rakase, who has been mining on a farm in the Popo area since 1991, highly successful black farmer, training other black farmers, exactly the sort of person that you would think the government would most want to help become a landowner. And there was a time in the period when Thabo Mbeki was president when it was possible for black people to acquire the ownership of land that was bought by the state for redistribution. But that policy fundamentally changed really from the time of the Zuma administration, and then it was formalized in 2013 with the state land lease and disposal policy. And that means, of course, that somebody like Mr. Rukhasi is not entitled to ownership. Now, the irony is that in 2002, in the Thabo Mbeki policy area, the state had agreed to sell him this farm at a particular price. Then it dragged its feet, possibly inefficiency, whatever. And finally, after many, many, many years, the DA helped him to go to court to get an order compelling the government to honor its agreement to him. And yet the government still said, even though Mr. Rukhasi was then 78 years old, that they wanted him to enter into at least a 30-year lease before they could consider the transfer of ownership. And the court fortunately said, well, by that time, Mr. Rukhasi might not be around at all. That's an absurd suggestion. You have to honor the agreement that you made with him in 2002. But it's extraordinary that the government was prepared to fight so hard to keep land ownership away from a black farmer who seemed to deserve it on every criterion that you could imagine, and yet had to go to court with the help of the DA to get the government to honor a promise that it made to him back in 2002.
I must say that it is just an extraordinary case where many a time one can at least say that, don't judge people by what they say, judge them by what they do, or vice versa. There's some leeway to play here. But in word, it is quite clear we have the efforts to amend the Bill of Rights for the first time. We have this expropriation bill. We have the land policy that you speak of. So those are the word aspects, but then actually they have acted quite aggressively on that in the case of Mr. Rukhasi, and perhaps to jump to a point that some of our audiences want to consider or want us to address is the protection that the courts might give. Now, that leads us actually to the question of the process of expropriation. What would be the steps? What would be the experience of the South African property owner if this expropriation bill were to become law?
Well, one has to just draw a distinction, I think, between the procedures set out in the preliminary stages, which are fairly reasonable, and the procedures at the point of expropriation, which is when it counts the most, when the rubber hits the road. And the procedures at the point of expropriation are heavily skewed in favor of the state. So let me explain. In terms of the preliminary steps, say a municipality that wants to expropriate land for a new housing development, an RDP scheme, must start by negotiating with the owner to buy it on reasonable terms. But what the municipality regards as reasonable may be very different from what the owner thinks, so there may be no agreement reached. Then the municipality must investigate the property, and it can send inspectors onto the property, but it must obtain either the owner's agreement, or if the owner doesn't agree, a court order authorizing its people to go onto the property to inspect it, which is reasonable. Third, the municipality must issue a notice of its intention to expropriate, in which it explains why it wants this property and what it's willing to pay in particular. And then the owner has the opportunity to raise objections to the expropriation and also to argue for a different amount of compensation backed up by supporting evidence. And the municipality must consider those representations, but unfortunately it does not have to respond to them. It doesn't have to give reasons for rejecting them. So how much consideration it practically gives to them, of course, is going to be difficult for any owner to assess. Then, if the municipality decides it is going to proceed with expropriation, that's when things really change in favor of the state, because the municipality can then serve the owner with a notice of expropriation, and that notice will state the dates on which the ownership of the property will automatically vest in the municipality. and when the right to possess the property will also automatically be transferred to the municipality simply by operation of law. And in that 1975 Act, the current Expropriation Act, when that was first promulgated, it said that ownership could not be transferred for 180 days from the service of the notice. What time limit does the bill have? It says that ownership cannot be transferred before the service of the notice of expropriation. That's all. So that implies that ownership could be transferred a day, a week, a month after the notice has been served. There's no safeguard for the owner in that. And there's no time limit laid down for the transfer of the right to possess the property. So there's a great risk that ownership and possession will pass very quickly to the municipality, leaving the owner rather reeling from the loss of what could be key assets. And what will increase the possibility of that is that, though the bill says that the compensation the municipality is prepared to pay should be paid over to the owner when it takes possession, the bill also says that the municipality can propose a later date for payment. And so it can circumvent that obligation by proposing a later date for payment. And that later date should either be agreed or it should be approved by a court. Getting court approval can take a long time, be expensive, and the municipality is most unlikely to pay when it takes possession if it's waiting for the court's approval, and when the bill also says that any dispute about compensation will not prevent the transfer of either ownership or possession. So those provisions are bad enough. Then we get to another one which is vaguely phrased but does indicate that the onus of proof will lie on the owner. The owner who wants to dispute the amount of compensation or the validity of the expropriation, is it really in the public interest, will bear the onus of proof. And if he or she fails to discharge that onus, fails to convince the presiding magistrate or the presiding judge that his view is correct, then he will have to pay not only his own substantial legal costs, but also most of the costs of the municipality. And that's an incredibly daunting burden. And it will deter most people from resorting to the courts. And then we also have, of course, adding to the complexity there, the uncertainty of the criteria. If the municipality has decided to give you nil compensation in terms of the clauses in the bill which allow that, those clauses are very vaguely phrased. It may say you've lost control of your property, squatters have invaded it, you haven't evicted them, so now we can expropriate it for nil compensation. And you must now persuade the court that you haven't really lost control of it, or that if you could just get the money to go to court and get an eviction order, then you'd get back control of it. And you shouldn't now have it taken from you for nil compensation as well. But will you succeed when the wording allows nil compensation for property over which you've lost control? And if it's not the nil compensation provisions, but rather the normal criteria for assessing compensation, market value and what they call the discount factors, which include things like the purpose of the expropriation, the history of the acquisition of the property, and the current use of the property. Now, how do you quantify that in monetary terms? So you can prove what the market value is, but if the municipality has said we're taking off 500,000 for the purpose of the expropriation, how can you prove that that's the inappropriate amount? That something lesser than that should be taken off for the purpose of the expropriation, or the current use of the property, or the history of its acquisition. So the uncertainty of the criteria make it hugely difficult for people to run the risk of litigation, because on these criteria, they are so uncertain, so difficult to quantify in monetary terms. How can you be confident that you will prevail, that you will convince a judge or a magistrate that the municipality's interpretation is wrong and yours is right, when it's also uncertain? So in practice, it's going to be extremely difficult for people to use what is a paper right to go to court, not a right that in practice will mean very much to most South Africans.
That is harrowing in a way. Looking at the circumstance of nil compensation or without compensation, let's call a spade a spade. Some legislators and jurists might think that nil compensation soothes the mind, but it's without compensation, whatever academics might dress it up to be. Those circumstances of without compensation in this expropriation bill, you mentioned the interpretation question. Is this list, I think it's 5 points that could lead to without compensation expropriation, is it a closed list in this piece of legislation?
No, it's not. And that's an incredibly important point, because the expropriation bill really provides examples of the circumstances in which no compensation could be paid. But it also makes it very clear that the list is not closed, that the examples it provides are nothing but that. So other possibilities are open too. And so officials in cash-strapped municipalities are likely to believe that no compensation should apply in another situation too, which would suit their particular purposes. And whether the owner will be able to go to court to contest this in the circumstances I've sketched is questionable. It again will be more of a paper right than a real one. So we have the real risk that nil compensation will apply in circumstances extending far beyond the 5 listed examples given in the bill. And those 5 listed examples are also very vaguely phrased. So it's going to be difficult for people to argue against a municipality that says, for example, you've lost control of the property and that entitles us to take it for nil compensation. Or the other examples as well, the wording is just too uncertain. So if a property poses some sort of hazard to people, what degree of hazard is necessary? We have the example a little while ago of a building that caught fire in the CBD, and there were firefighters who died and people had to be evacuated. It was all very stressful. But there are probably many other properties in the CBD which potentially are also fire hazards. Are they all now to be up for expropriation for nil compensation when, perhaps they're not as bad as the municipality might depict them to be, or some simple step could be taken to prevent any risk, and yet the municipality will say it's a hazard and take it, and then leave you to argue that this is wrong.
A very striking example that you give in the issue alert, when you argue the point that this will give a law-abiding property owner essentially fewer rights or less legal protection than someone running a heroin business out of a warehouse. Perhaps you could sketch out why that is a real risk in terms of this bill.
It's because, if you are some sort of drug lord running heroin out of that warehouse that you own, the government does have the power to seize that property, but it can't do it until it has proved that the property is being used for the purposes of a crime. And it has to satisfy a judge of that on a balance of probabilities before it gets a court order, which allows it to proceed. But as we've been talking about in the case of a final expropriation, it doesn't need a court order. It can simply issue the notice of expropriation, take ownership and possession, and leave it to the owner to go to court if the owner can afford to do so and can run the risk of doing so. And what the bill is therefore doing is contradicting not only the common law, but also the Constitution. And it's just worth thinking about the common law for a moment, because it has recognized for centuries that people must have their property rights protected against the takings of the state. That this is just as important as the right to habeas corpus. That's the rule, that if the government detains your person, you can get a court order demanding that your person should be released. And equally in the case of property, the government cannot send its policemen or any officials to search and seize it without first getting a warrant, a search and seizure order from the courts. And that's also why in those preliminary phases, if the municipality wants to send inspectors onto your property and you object, the municipality has to get a court order authorizing those officials to enter onto your property. But when it comes to a final expropriation, the municipality does not need a court order. It can simply issue the notice of expropriation and take the property. And that, of course, is what the Expropriation Act of 1975 provided. But at that point, we didn't have a Bill of Rights. We had the doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty. Parliament could lay down any law that it liked, and the courts had no power to challenge it. Now we have a constitution which guarantees the supremacy of the rule of law, which confirms that everybody has the right to equality before the law, which lays down criteria which have to be met before an expropriation can be valid, which says that nobody can be evicted from their home without a prior court authorization, which says everybody has the right to just and fair administrative action, and an expropriation is an administrative action, and so on. So the government is now repeating in the bill the provision that couldn't be challenged in the 1975 Act, and thereby completely overlooking the fact that we now do have this constitution under which people, black and white, have all these rights. So clearly what should be done is, if a municipality wants to proceed with an expropriation and the owner disputes the amount or the validity, the municipality should go to court. The municipality should bear the onus of proving that what it proposes to do complies with all the constitutional requirements, that it will uphold equality before the law, that it will meet all the criteria for a valid expropriation, that if people are to be evicted from their home, all the relevant circumstances pointing to the fairness or unfairness of this have been taken into account. That's the minimum that the municipality should do. And only after it has discharged that onus and a court has confirmed that all constitutional requirements have been met, only then should it be able to issue a notice of expropriation.
So it's almost there's some sort of schizophrenia in the law here. In the one sense, they adhere to the common law idea of, in the preliminary stages, but then at some point the legal reasoning and rationale just breaks down. So that leads us to ask the question: is this expropriation bill necessary?
Well, the government would say that we needed to speed up land reform and make a success of it, is what it implies. But we know from the high-level panel of Parliament that was appointed by the government itself that it's not land acquisition costs that are the problem with land reform. There are many other issues. And if we are to achieve what should really be the goal, to have an expanding class of commercial farmers, both black and white, then we need very different interventions than those contained in the bill. And more than anything else, we need secure property rights for all those farmers so that they can use their land as collateral, that they can be confident of building it up as an asset that the government can't just take away from them. And in the housing context, the government talks also about the fact that there's a massive housing shortage in the country, which of course there is. But it's not land acquisition costs that stand in the way of that. Again, it's the government's own inefficiency. Many of the houses it builds are so poorly built that they have to be demolished and start again. Its housing building has slowed down enormously. The whole process of installing infrastructure and getting necessary permits is very slow. But fundamentally also, it's not really the role of the government to be providing free housing. What it should be doing is setting up an economy in which businesses can thrive, skilled people can get jobs, they can meet their own housing needs with the help of the banks and mortgage finance. And for the poorest, we should use housing vouchers, where some of the tax revenues being so very badly used by the government are transferred to lower income households so that they can do what they've long been saying to the government, build a better house with that money than the government is ever going to do for them. And it would give them the power of agency, and it would mean that the money that's, as it were, entrusted to them would be very much better used by them in their own interests than it is by bureaucrats who don't really care what happens to the tax revenue and are often looking to obtain their own slice for their own benefit. So if we're trying to speed up land reform, if we're trying to improve housing, the bill is the worst thing that we could possibly do. Instead, we need very different interventions to turn land reform and commercial farming into success and make sure that all South Africans have the jobs and homes they need.
I think it was William Gladstone, the olden Victorian politician, who said that it should be the job of government to make as easy as possible for the citizen to do what is right, and as difficult as possible for the citizen to do what is wrong. And I think every South African can agree that, the dignity of a job, working hard to provide for yourself, your family, your loved ones, is the right thing to do. So the fact that if we are looking at this problem, it's not a laissez-faire, social Darwinism. It is exactly as you say, this housing voucher idea. If you can get the economy going, then we can provide and adhere to that almost Gladstonian standard of helping people to make it easy to do what is right.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct, and that people, South Africans, would be very much happier if they had a greater opportunity for self-reliance, for agency, for not being entirely dependent on the government. And I think the polling that the IRR has been doing over many years confirms that people would most like to have education and jobs. And when they're asked whether land reform or BEE and affirmative action are the things they most want, resoundingly they say no. They know that A, these things are not particularly effective, but also they want that self-reliance. They want the opportunity to get ahead based on their own efforts rather than having to wait on the state to provide.
So go to the last few questions that I have, and I apologize for the few minutes we lost when my internet went rogue. We've been talking a lot about the municipality being able to do that, the municipality being able to do this. And I think to many South Africans, this is a new development to hear that the municipality can do A, B, or C, because I think the broader narrative has been, it will be the national government, the national state, the most, clear manifestation in quotation marks of the will of the people that will manage these elements. Now, we have a very clear idea from the Auditor General what municipalities are capable of or incapable of in terms of either corruption or proper management. But perhaps it would be worthwhile to ask the question, under this expropriation bill, who would be empowered to expropriate property?
Well, potentially it's a very long list, because in essence, it's any organ of state that has the power to expropriate, either under other legislation or under the bill itself. Certainly, it would include the Minister of Public Works and Infrastructure and all the municipalities. The government has said it would include the president, the 9 premiers. And it would also include national departments, provincial departments, and various state-owned enterprises such as Eskom. Which, if we consider land as the property to be taken, sometimes does need land for its pylons and distribution networks and so on. So potentially a very long list of organs of state could have the power to use this bill. And the point of this bill is to say that from now on, once the bill is law, every organ of state must comply with these particular procedures, will have the power to take property for nil compensation, if they think that that's appropriate in their particular example, or for less than market value, for sure, and using the procedure which I've sketched, which allows, in essence, the state to expropriate first and the owner to argue later, which is extraordinarily unfair and against the Constitution. And perhaps while we're talking about municipalities, it's also just worth mentioning that already they don't comply with the law. Under the current Expropriation Act, municipalities do also have the power to expropriate, and they are supposed to go through some of these preliminary steps, fewer than the bill provides. But one of the most crucial, of course, is to serve a notice of expropriation on the owner. And yet there are examples in KwaZulu-Natal where Becky Dlamini, for example, lost 3,000 hectares of land and didn't even know, because he was never served with a notice of expropriation. He simply discovered after the event that the land had already been registered in the name of the municipality by the deeds registry. So he got no notice, he got no compensation, he just lost his land. And when he tried to go to court to object, they said, well, it's now too late. Perhaps you could have done this earlier. But he didn't know earlier what was going on. And how vulnerable people will be up and down the country to municipalities that won't necessarily comply even with these highly skewed to in their favor rules that I've been talking about. And people with limited experience of what municipal powers might be will just be taken by surprise. They won't know what's happened to them until it becomes extremely difficult to do anything about it.
I mean, that's terrifying, really, I think, for all property owners, but also South Africans who aspire to being property owners. Because, I mean, I, for one, don't have significant assets behind my name, but one day I would want to be able to own a home, and that aspirant class might be bigger than the current property ownership class. But it's very important to understand that, there are some fundamental threats to your aspirations, not just in terms of the economic implications of this, but just, will you be able to own your home one day? I mean, these are terrifying insights that this bill really brings forward, and this bill must be scrutinized, or gives reason why this bill must be scrutinized. So, if I may ask I'm going to combine my last two questions in one for time's sake. This bill, does it provide, or does it lay the groundwork for, as it were, full-scale expropriation without compensation? And does it offer a real possibility for improving the lives of South Africans at all?
Full-scale expropriation without compensation. There are two ways in which one might get to that. The nil compensation provisions could be used, but I think what is more likely is that the government will rely on a definition of expropriation in the bill, which looks, rather harmless, and it simply says that expropriation is the compulsory acquisition of property. But what it's getting to is a distinction, a quite technical and really arbitrary distinction between the acquisition of ownership by the state, which would count as expropriation, for which some compensation should normally be paid, and the assumption of custodianship by the state, which would not be regarded as an expropriation at all, and hence no compensation would be payable. Under our constitution, if the state deprives you of property, it doesn't have to pay compensation. It's only if it expropriates property from you that it ought to pay just and equitable compensation. So the difference between ownership and custodianship is essentially a technical one. From the point of the expropriated owner, it makes no difference if you've lost your property to the state as owner or to the state as custodian. You've still lost your property. But the critical difference is that the government will then argue that if it's custodianship it's taken, it doesn't have to pay compensation at all. And in 2014, the government put forward a bill that would have vested all agricultural land in the custodianship of the Department of Agriculture, etc. And that was modeled on what we've already done in this sphere. We've already vested all mineral resources in the custodianship of the state, all water resources in the custodianship of the state. And both the ANC and the EFF would very much like to vest all land in the custodianship of the state. That would require separate legislation. There would have to be a bill providing for that. But with this definition of expropriation in the bill, it would be much easier for the government to argue that when it takes custodianship, it's not expropriating and it doesn't have to pay compensation. And that's really the way in which we could get a sweeping EWC taking of land and the improvements on it, which the government would argue adhere to the land. Does this offer a way for South Africans to sort of move ahead and become more prosperous, if I recall the second part of your question? The answer, not at all, because what this bill is doing, certainly in combination with the amendment to the Constitution, other legislation that's going to come in time, is vastly empowering the government to take ownership or custodianship of land and a whole number of other assets in the country. And its policy will not be to transfer the ownership to other people, but rather to allow them access at most through a lease or some kind of land use agreement, which can be terminated by the state in wide-ranging circumstances. And people will lose what is the most important way of developing a better life, acquiring an asset, building it up, seeing its value appreciate over time, transferring it to your children so they start with a head start compared to where you began. That's the way in which people all around the world are able to build up their individual prosperity, and property is vital to it. And they are going, in many instances, to lose that option. Certainly, this is what the bill will help pave the way to. And we know, unfortunately, that the ANC is heavily committed to the ideology of the National Democratic Revolution, which aims to push South Africa from a free market system to socialism and then ultimately to communism. And of course, you can't have a socialist or communist system with private property rights. You need comprehensive state control, and you can't attain that degree of control if millions of people own their own homes or other assets. And of course, if you're going to have a private property system, it also is vital to the functioning of the free market. Take away the private property system and it becomes much harder for the market to function at all. So the government has an ideological incentive to take the kind of further steps that I'm sketching, and which would be absolutely destructive of the well-being of all South Africans. And we see Venezuela and Zimbabwe as the recent examples of just how badly things can go wrong.
Julio Sanfona and Peter Creer actually asked two questions that are very, very similar, and I'm going to give a stab at answering them briefly, and then perhaps give it over to you before we wrap up. And that is a question about the banks and debt owed on property. The Institute last year, almost exactly a year ago, engaged very heavily and very, some would say aggressively, but that's perhaps not always the wrong thing. But, you know, if the shoe fits, then perhaps kick something with it. And the campaign asked the question of the banks, if someone with debt on a property were to lose that property through expropriation, would you, the banks, still expect the citizen deprived of this property connected to the debt they owe you, would you still expect them to be liable for the debt and paying off the money they owe you on the loan or the bond or whatever they placed in mechanistic functioning to make sure that they can afford this property? And it took a few weeks and a few letters, and gradually the pressure built, and friends of the IRR really made it possible for us to continually build this pressure until the Banking Association of South Africa came out and said, yes, they would expect South Africans deprived of their property rights to pay down banking debts on expropriated property. And the reason BASA gave, the Banking Association of South Africa, was fascinating, because they said otherwise it would blow a multi-trillion rand hole in the banking system. So it struck me as a real, I mean, that takes guts to tell your client base that at this stage you will not stand for their property rights, but when they lose their property rights, you will still go them, with entertaining the absurd notion that people might still have sufficient resources for the banks to lay claim over. But I think that was a very revealing and a crucial moment in the whole decades-long debate about property rights in South Africa, and it's something that that the IRR has been pushing very, very aggressively. And I would encourage anyone listening to this or watching this to contact your bank. If you haven't made a nuisance of yourself asking these questions of your bank and insisting on getting an answer, then really we haven't given this our all. We haven't chucked the kitchen sink at it. And if we don't, we might not have a kitchen sink to chuck. So I would really encourage South Africans, don't, make a call, send an email, but don't be, aggressive and rude to the person on the other side of the line initially. Ask them, I think a good script to proceed is to say, I'm a client of you, of your bank and of your financial institution, and I want to speak to the person whose job it is for me to make their life difficult. I want to speak to the person who gets sufficient payment and salary and income for my unhappiness and my frustration about my bank's position, my property rights to fall on, and keep on hammering that point until you get an answer or no answer, and then keep on keeping on. And then a challenge I want to issue today to the banks of South Africa, to ABSA, to Nedbank, to Standard Bank, to all the financial institutions that we've engaged with over the last year. You have until the 28th of February to make submissions on the Expropriation Bill. Be honest, corporate citizens, and make submissions to Parliament on this bill making clear what it will mean for your clients, to whom you have a legal and moral responsibility, and make clear to Parliament and the committee in Parliament the consequences of this bill and its functioning as explained today by Anthea on your own functioning. If you don't, South Africans will read into that a question of trust. Your entire industry is based on asking us, the South African people, to trust you with our assets. Now it's time to return the favor and show us we should. Anthea, on a final question, what can South Africans do to fight this bill, and is it worth fighting? Isn't this a lost cause already?
It's absolutely worth fighting, and the opportunity to make written submissions is still there until the 28th of February. And perhaps it's just worth recalling that the first expropriation bill came out in 2008 after the Polokwane conference in December 2007, which brought Jacob Zuma to the ANC presidency. And that bill was, in the end, withdrawn because of the opposition that was mounted by the IRR and others. The next bill came in 2013. It was also withdrawn because of the opposition from the IRR and others. The 2015 bill did go through Parliament, but in the end, it was not signed into law by President Jacob Zuma, as he was then, because the objections raised by the IRR and others to procedural unfairnesses in the process of adopting that bill gave him pause. And so he decided that the bill must go back to Parliament and be reconsidered. So there is a long history of raising objections, of raising voices, of pointing to all the negative consequences of a bill like this. And I think that the history shows that we can successfully resist, we can induce the ANC to reconsider. What we have to do now in this COVID context is to point out that in a way everything has changed. Because whereas our economy was limping along before, now under the COVID lockdowns, we're really at a point of extraordinary crisis, where GDP is likely to fall by 8% this year, where the government is contemplating the public debt rising to 100% of GDP within a couple of years, where we face a real prospect of a sovereign debt crisis. And in that context, does the government really want to further cripple the economy through an expropriation bill that cannot meet its stated objectives of helping with land reform or home ownership, but will be successful in really putting the kibosh on any hope of reconstruction and recovery of in the post-COVID period? And the fact that we're in this crisis now provides yet another opportunity to say to the government, this has to be rethought. And we can also now demand that the government should honor its own policy. Every new bill is supposed to be accompanied by a comprehensive socioeconomic assessment. And the final report, which looks at all the pros and cons of adopting a particular policy, which considers whether there weren't better ways perhaps of meeting the goals, which haven't been taken into account, all of that is supposed to have been comprehensively assessed and fully reported on and made available to people with the bill, so that when they make their written submissions, they have the benefit of that report available to them. And there is no such report on the expropriation bill. And the COVID context, again, makes it particularly important. In this economic environment, we need a comprehensive CS report that sets out what the consequences for recovery are going to be if we go this route. And people must insist on that, and they can do so in the period that still lies ahead for the lodging of written submissions. And those who feel perhaps a bit insecure about writing to Parliament can take advantage of the submissions that have been prepared by the IRR, by other organizations, to help people see whether this particular point of view is something they themselves embrace and something that they themselves want to put forward to Parliament as their own submission on this bill.
Anthea, thank you very, very much. So, final concluding remarks from my side. We cannot promise you that if you stand with us, that we win this fight, but we can promise you that if you don't, we lose it. There are immense consequences to what we do now. A pet statistic of mine that I've been trotting out over the last few weeks is the fact that 35 million South Africans were entitled to vote in the 2019 election. The ANC won its majority in 2019 with just over 10 million votes. That means we have 20 million plus South Africans who did not vote for this government. Now, that does not compromise the legitimacy of this government. That's not how constitutional democracy works, I'm afraid. But what it does is it shows clearly that there's a cost to uninvolvement. There's a cost to a lack of participation. There is something that you can do. It's not always easy to spell out what it is, but the first step is to become involved. This first step is to become involved and then educated and then active and make sure that you become, as it were, a missionary for a vision of freedom in this country. This isn't something that we must fight because we want to preserve some fictitious privilege. This is something we need to fight because we want to preserve the hope that was promised to South Africa 3 decades ago. And that came close to fruition at several points and is a hope that most South Africans still fundamentally believe in, but to a decreasing extent. This is a crucial point for our country, and it is really up to you, the citizen, to make a difference. Don't look back in 10 years' time thinking I could have done more. And to perhaps quote a second British Prime Minister betraying my love for British history, this is not the beginning of the end, but it might be the end of the beginning. We're going to need you to be with us in the long haul, because on the other side of this, there's a South Africa that we can now mold. It could be the South Africa of the National Democratic Revolution, of socialist failure, of continued deprivation, of the haves having more and the have-nots having less, of people no longer living near the breadline, no longer clinging to it, but living far below it, abandoned and forgotten. Or it can be the South Africa that you have the potential to make it. It really is up to you. We will be in the trenches and we want to see you there with us. Anthea, thank you so much for your time, and thank you very much for your work on this bill and for fighting the good fight. I want to thank all our listeners and our viewers today and the technical team behind the scenes making this all possible. Thank you for fighting the battle of ideas, the most important battle of our time. On that note, from me, Herman Pretorius, I thank you and I wish you a very blessed day. All the best. God bless.